that what's happened in Macedonia is a political crisis which has got nothing to do with the migrants whatsoever. And it began last February when there were leaks which showed or appeared to show that the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister basically or his intelligence service run by his cousin had been wiretapping some 20,000 people, which is vast for a country of 2 million. Basically everybody important had been listened to, including people in his own government. And what it then appeared to show was kind of quite a high level of corruption, fixing the judiciary, and basically the type of things which are not so uncommon here in Ukraine. But and the fact that things that kind of everybody kind of more or less kind of knew, but to be kind of faced with the facts was something different. So this began a political crisis. The EU came in, they kind of helped negotiate a deal. The Prime Minister resigned at the beginning of the year, and this is supposed to have led to, or is supposed to lead to elections. Now the crisis has flared up again, and at this point, there has been a kind of veiled threat to take action against certain politicians, because effectively what happened was, as part of the EU deal, was that a special prosecutor was appointed who began investigating 56 politicians, mostly but not all connected somehow to the Prime Minister, well, including the Prime Minister, and was supposed to investigate alleged crimes arising from what came out of the wiretaps, and then the President just annulled the investigations. So this then kind of sparked off demonstrations again, and this has led to these kind of threats from Brussels to do something. The fact is that the EU is a declining political power in terms of Macedonia, but because the fact is that for so long Macedonia has been blocked in its EU and NATO integration path because of the fact initially of its dispute over its name with Greece. So people are thinking, well, if I'm not going to go anywhere, well, what are you're not really promising very much. Therefore, the clout has gone down. It doesn't completely disappear because, they did negotiate a deal before. But I mean, let's see whether they can negotiate another one. But now it's a bit harder. All the Macedonian leaders were summoned to a meeting in Vienna with the European Commissioner who's in charge of enlargement, and the opposition leaders the main opposition leaders set a very high set of conditions which could never have been met. So the talks never took place. Well, the key difference, there's one very important difference between Macedonia and all the Western Balkan countries, is they have this definite promise, and they have this kind of what's called the European perspective, and Ukraine doesn't have that, and none of the kind of former Soviet countries have that. Well, I think there's probably two reasons. One is that he wanted to, it was a way of kind of rejigging, gaining control within his own party, within the party coalition in parliament, which he has not done that very well on, because the way that kind of the electoral maths has worked out, although he still has a majority in parliament with a coalition, he has less people in his coalition, so that hasn't worked out that well, but the coalition still has a majority in parliament. The other thing is that they have to do a lot of things which economically will be very difficult, type of things which will have to happen here, partly as a result of an IMF deal, which is they've got a bloated public administration, and that needs to be cut, and a lot of jobs rely on that. And by having an election now, that gives him 4 years. So if he'd had to do a lot of unpleasant things in the next year or two, that wouldn't have been, and his popularity had gone down, then that wouldn't have secured re-election. So in theory, he's now kind of he's now re-elected for 4 years. I think that kind of throughout the Balkans there's this kind of authoritarian strongman tendency, and I think that Mr. Vucic certainly kind of has that. So whether that's kind of healthy for democracy or not is another question. So many of the problems which are quite similar here, you see in Serbia and the Balkans, like for example, actually perhaps less so at the moment. I'm not so sure here of much of the media in Serbia is sort of quite cowed and kind of following the kind of government line, and investigative journalists are suddenly finding kind of themselves being denounced as spies and things in the media. So perhaps that's like less of a problem here, but that's certainly been a problem in Serbia at the moment. And I think that also, because it's quite a small country, that you have a kind of formal system of how things are supposed to work, but whether it actually works like that, or whether it's basically the Prime Minister rings people up and says, do this or do that, and that's the way it works, rather than going through the institutions, I think it's much more of that, and that, you know, whether that will be any different in 3 or 4 years' time, you know, I'm not so sure. Well, yes, it is a global trend, and certainly the kind of the right are very much back in control in Croatia, and in Austria. We've seen that over the elections of the weekend as well, and in Macedonia too. We've seen this kind of populist centre-right, but especially kind of populist party and government in power for the last few years. So it's part of a trend. Whether if the world was different, I'm not so sure the Balkans would be different, because they have kind of specific reasons in the Balkans. But yes, it is certainly part of a trend. In English, there are so few books about Ukraine for such a big and important and strategic country. It's just incredible how few books there are if you go into a bookshop or if you look online. There are a couple of history books, there's a couple of kind of quite dense political science books, but there's nothing which really brings Ukraine to life, which makes people kind of three-dimensional kind of people. What I wanted to do was I wanted to write the book that I would have read. And at the beginning of the conflict, if this book had existed, then I would have bought it, because that's what was lacking, and that's what I wanted to read. For better or worse, the EU integration system has kind of more or less worked and pushing them in the right direction. And you had these kind of oligarchs who emerged after communism in this kind of chaotic period. But kind of the EU integration system has kind of tamed that and just sort of push them in the right direction. And, you know, there's a fine, you know, Poland or Estonia maybe in a different place from Bulgaria, but more or less they're kind of going in the right direction. And then you've got, on the other side, you've got kind of Russia, where Putin, okay, he's built this authoritarian state, but he did crush the political power of the oligarchs. And Ukraine has done neither. So that's part of Ukraine's problem, is this kind of being stuck in the middle and not having done either. And now trying to catch up. And it's difficult to catch up because you're so far behind.